Hello everybody, and welcome to The Guilt Monster, Grief's complicated sidekick. I'm Liesl Dawson from the University of Bristol, and I'm really pleased to be hosting this session. Why is guilt such a common ingredient of grief? And what can we do to stop ourselves from spinning out into repetitive thoughts of self-blame? With me today is Julia Samual MBE, one of the UK's leading psychotherapists, and also the author of two fantastic books, GriefWorks and This Too Shall Pass. And she's with us today to talk about these questions. So welcome, Julia. It's lovely to have you here.
Oh, thank you for having me, and hello to everybody that's joined us. And I hope, even if everyone gets just one thing from today, I hope you'll each get something, and maybe it's permission to feel what you feel. But I hope by unraveling some of what we understand, it will help those listening, because it's as Elizabeth Kubler-Ross said, guilt is the most painful companion of grief, and we want to do what we can to try and diminish that unwelcome side monster kick companion.
Absolutely. So can I start today really by asking you to talk a little bit about the relationship between guilt and grief? Why is this such a common ingredient?
I mean, just to go back one step, is that guilt is it's a feeling, it isn't a fact. And I think sometimes people conflate, I feel bad and that makes me bad. And we're wired with guilt because it's socially important to recognize if we've hurt somebody or we've done something to preserve good relationships. So we need access to feelings of guilt. And actually those that don't feel guilty tend to be sociopaths. So it's not about not feeling guilty. And guilt is a feeling, it's a feeling that we've done harm, that we've done something wrong, whereas regret and remorse is a deep regret of the action of actually having committed something wrong. So the feeling and the action are two different things. And with grief, guilt comes in many different forms, but it's the very unwelcome burden that we put on ourselves often. Often it's our relationship with ourselves. It's a sort of intensified guilt loop that we kind of play in our minds on a daily basis, and it has a physiological and a psychological impact. And when it is very intense, that burden can lead to complicated grief, to much more complicated long-term difficulties with their grieving process. It hinders the natural adaptive grieving process, because as much as we don't want to be grieving, an important thing to remember is that grieving is a natural process, and the things that we do to block grieving are often the things that do us harm. So it's not about not having the guilt or not having the feelings, it's about how we are in relationship to them and how we manage ourselves given that we have those feelings. And just to add one more kind of backdrop image is that at the moment of the death, all of us are affected in different ways depending on our psychological makeup. So that would include our attachment, our kind of early parenting, how confident or secure our attachment was. It would include the relationship with the person that's died. It would include the circumstances of the death. It would include our previous history of losses. And it would include the support and connection to others we have at the time and after the death. And every lens of those that has a fault line in it, the more complex the grieving is. And actually that fault line is often where we find the sort of toxicity of guilt. So it's useful for each individual to kind of look at themselves and see the kind of roots to what's got them into the particular way that they are, which will be affected by all of those things I've talked about.
Yeah, no, that makes perfect sense. Could we spend
Glad.
some... No, it does. And obviously, you know, and I think one thing you've said before also is that when we experience a grief, we're often taken back to earlier griefs and earlier experiences. So again, those early attachments and any pain in those early attachments will be kind of lit up again when we have a bereavement. I wonder if we can talk a little bit about the different kinds of guilt that people often experience. And I wonder if we could start with survivor's guilt. Could you say what survivor's guilt is and how it impacts grief?
Yes, I mean, first of all, I think when other people talk about feeling guilty, the response from their friends and family is don't be guilty. And that doesn't, you know, as we all know, that doesn't really work. So it is about kind of trying to unpack and work out, examine the sort of familiar domains of where you're getting your grief from. And survivor's guilt, the most commonly known is the most extreme version really is Holocaust survivors who the expectation would be that you've survived, you feel kind of relieved that you're alive, but actually there's a lot of research showing that Holocaust survivors had massive survivor's guilt. And had to find ways of dealing with that. And often, you know, Isaac Bashevis singer who took his own life? No, Primo Levi was a survivor. And he wrote these wonderful books, Is This a Man? But actually, I think most of us think that the survivor's guilt is what killed him in the end, that he didn't find a way of managing it. And that's the most extreme version. But it's when you feel that maybe if you have a child die or a partner that's died, maybe you're in a car crash, you wish, you somehow feel that you're bad to have survived and that they deserve to live and you didn't deserve to live.
Yeah, that makes sense. And the other place I've seen it quite a bit is with bereavement with siblings. That often I've noticed in memoirs that there's that sense that I'm the wrong sibling to have lived, and that seems to creep in there. But the kind of accident and car crash makes sense as well. Can you say something about the kind of guilt we feel when we feel that in some way the death was our fault? You know, if I had said this, if I had done this, somehow I could have stopped this death from occurring.
Yeah, it's the sort of tyranny of shoulds. It's all the what ifs. If I'd rung the doctor earlier, if I hadn't gone out for a walk, if I'd decided to take the car, it's like the sliding doors. That the moment of the death, you go back and you examine every decision that led to the death and wanting to sort of unpick that and change it in the hope that you'll have a different outcome. And I often think about that when I'm working with people is, you know, to recognize the limits of their control. It's often about control, that if I had loved them enough, if I'd been a good enough partner, parent, friend, I would have done the right thing and they would have survived. And so what I often do is get them to align their feeling and their thinking, so their head and their heart, so that they can recognize that this feeling of love that you've somehow failed and you feel guilty is a natural feeling that you have, and it gives you the tyranny of shoulds, but also the fact that you're not God. There's a limit of the power that you have. Things happen regularly that are beyond your control. So thinking that it's your fault and you're guilty and that you deserve to feel guilty because you've somehow failed just isn't the reality. It's a kind of magical thinking. But if you hold both, you don't try. Often people try and knock their thinking out with their feeling, but actually if you allow both, you can find a bit more peace, in a way, resolution, when you can allow both aspects of you to speak.
That makes sense. I mean, it does sound also that this particular kind of guilt is linked in some ways to denial, that there's a way in which keep going around that loop and saying, if I had stopped my son from getting a motorbike, if I had, you know, stopped the nurse from giving that shot of morphine, that there's a way in which you keep trying to get back to the moment and fix it so that the loved one isn't dead. And it sort of pushes the reality of the death back and stops you from feeling the pain of loss, which I think you rightly say, this is the way that we come to move grief through the body. It's by feeling that pain. And, pain is the agent of change, which is one of my favorite quotations from you.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. Is the complexity of it is that, of course, we need denial. If we allow ourselves to face and feel the full impact of the person's death all at once, it's completely overwhelming and we feel like we won't survive. And we all, in the way that I talked about, that you go back to your early coping mechanisms from your attachment and what's been modeled to you as a child, you go back to your default ways of coping when things go wrong, and you don't choose that. And one of them would be denial. I mean, it's a survivor response, and it's it's how we manage pain. But the thing that's difficult in relation to guilt is that we can get intractably stuck in that guilt loop. And so you don't move in and out of feeling guilty, you stay stuck feeling guilty, and then that can prolong and intensify your grief, and then, interfere with your outcomes, give you more negative outcomes.
That makes sense. Would you say there's particular kinds of deaths that in particular incite this kind of guilt? I'm thinking, I guess, about things like suicide, that the sense that a death is preventable. Are there other things as well that might be, that you're particularly in danger of thinking that you could have stopped that death from occurring?
I think suicide is a particular one. I think the roles you have, so being a parent, the kind of definition of a successful or good parent, if you like, is that your children thrive and are well. And when your children, however old they are, when they die, you somehow feel you must have failed. You can go back and look in the womb if they have cancer. Did I eat some sort of cheese that has given them cancer? If I'd been a good parent, they wouldn't have wanted to do this. So there's a role link to self-blame, that you sort of feel that you failed and that you're guilty. And I think, again, it's a sort of magical thinking, isn't it? This thing of if guilt is a feeling of being bad, that somehow I've caused harm, the reverse feeling is if I'm good things happen. And actually, it isn't as logical as that in grief, but I think that's where people get stuck in it. Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, that makes perfect sense. And I think, I can see that as a parent, you always feel like that's your job to protect them. So if anything happens, even when it's beyond your control, you feel that guilt. And I imagine that's true for miscarriage and stillbirth, for mothers, and also for drug overdose, that this is another one of these that people can be haunted by in terms of thinking, or wishing that there were things they could have done to change
all
things.
The what ifs. All the what ifs.
Yeah, all the what ifs. Can I ask
sorry, I interrupted you, but in the what ifs, where there are holes in the story, where there are pieces of the jigsaw that you don't know, so maybe your child was traveling and on a gap year and died of a drugs overdose. Sometimes you can't always get the information. The pieces of the puzzle that are missing can drive you mad, and also they increase your sense of guilt that somehow, again, being a good parent, that you would have protected your child not to get them into dangerous situations.
No, that makes sense. Can I ask about a different kind of guilt? And this is the guilt that comes from a relationship that's quite complicated. Maybe when the person died, you were not on good terms. There's lots of unfinished business, or even, you've had an argument and the person's died between that, occurrence and you sort of getting forgiveness. So what about that kind of guilt?
I mean, that very much links to the session I've just done on sudden death and the sort of unassailable assault that a sudden death can have on your body and your being, where it's like there's a half-written sentence and you don't get the opportunity to finish the sentence. So you don't get to say, I'm sorry. You don't get to say, I love you. Or a relationship that actually has been, you haven't spoken for years. You know, there's always that hope that you will at some point have a reconciliation. And when they die, that reconciliation is no longer possible. So you're left with this sort of massive wall of regret, really, I suppose it is, from action that gives you massive, or lack of action, or kind of words that you'd said. So you feel bad and have regret for that. And then that gives you a real sense of guilt that you've done something wrong, and a feeling of guilt. And that's incredibly intense.
Yeah. And the fact that oh, yeah, go on.
We can't see each other, so we can't read our signals.
Yes.
I think there's, in that domain to some extent, with suicide and murder and relationships that are fractured beforehand, but then feel kind of devastated by death, is sort of unmentionable guilt. And I think in a way that is the most pervasive, because you can't even voice it to people. So there's a sense, I think often that's entangled with shame. Shame and guilt are really horrible bedfellows, and self-loathing. So people can really pile up and attack themselves. But if they can't even voice it for whatever it is that they find unmentionable, then that is incredibly toxic and damaging in your relationship with yourself, and then your capacity to process the grief.
Yeah. So that seems like, again, it's crucial to try to get people to voice their guilty feelings and to get them out into the open. That, I mean, we often find that things are less horrible once we've said them, once we've shared them. You know, the people are less shocked than we think they're going to be, you know, once we get them out. And I guess that's where therapy and friendship can come in. Yeah. No, I was gonna, you carry on, and then I'll move to my next.
Well, I mean, the two things that came up when you spoke then. One is that we kind of think we're making sense when we have the loop in our head, but actually we can get very stuck in those loops. And it's only by kind of going into ourselves, finding words to describe this inchoate feeling that's in our bodies, putting words to it and voicing them, and then being heard with curiosity and compassion and interest, that we can sort of see what we're feeling, and that can help us adjust in a kind of little momentary wake up to what has been going on and allow us to process it. And for people who can't quite take the leap to talk to someone, journaling really helps. So one of the kind of first steps I would be is, when you're looking at your guilt, is to break it down, as we've talked about. Look at the can't even say the words, familiar domains. Is it survivor's guilt? Is it the cause of guilt? Is it the relationship? Is it a failure of roles? Is it unmentionable? So begin to examine it and look at it and write that down. And then maybe that can give you the next step of talking to somebody else about it, so that you begin to adjust to it and learn to live with it. Because again, it isn't this thing of kind of wiping it out and saying I'm all clear. It's processing it and adjusting to the discomfort of it.
Yeah, no, that's really fascinating. And I've also read that it's really therapeutic and helpful sometimes to write the story from a different point of view.
Oh,
so you know, you tell the story of your father's death, but you tell it from the point of view of your father, or you tell it from the point of view of your mother or your sister, and you put yourself in the third person, because actually we're our own worst critics. And sometimes it's by looking at ourselves through others' eyes that we can feel that compassion, and also see our actions in a much more kind of, you know, less emotive way, where we're blaming ourselves. So that, I think, is also useful as a kind of experiment.
I think that's a really, really lovely idea. And I guess it comes from the Gestalt empty chair, isn't it? That you kind of find the voice of the person that you're talking to and hear it from their perspective. And also by hearing it from their voice, as you're saying, is that you can be much more compassionate to somebody else's voice than you are to your own. So one of the things that, you know, as we said, people turn against themselves and really dig in and attack themselves. And one of the key levers is to support yourself and have a self-compassionate voice. And so in doing what you're saying is a really lovely way of finding your compassionate voice for yourself through the lens of somebody else's.
Oh, that's
And
beautifully,
maybe you could use
beautifully
lots
put.
of voices. You could use your friend's voice, your father's voice. You know, you could try the story from different perspectives, and that would give you a fuller picture.
Yes, absolutely. And I sometimes think that's one of the reasons why memoir is so therapeutic, actually, because you're putting yourself in the narrative. I wonder about a different kind of guilt. And this is the guilt that comes from feeling happy in the midst of grief, suddenly recognizing maybe you think you're forgetting bits of, you know, the person who's died, or you start moving on and you feel guilt over this. What can you say about that guilt?
It's incredibly common. I've heard 1,000 different ways. I hadn't ever laughed, and then I heard myself laughing, and I had a moment of joy, and then I had that stab of guilt that came swiftly afterwards, and totally kind of shattered my joy. And this comes from, you know, the task of mourning is facing the reality of the death and knowing in a way that you can't not know that the person has died, and incrementally over time adjusting to that new reality that you didn't want and you didn't need, but also recognizing that the relationship with the person doesn't die, that the love continues. And I think the guilt around having moments of joy, or if your partner died, going on a date, is this feeling like you have an image of the person that's died that is looking down at you. It's from your heart or in your mind or in heaven. And you're, by being sad and demonstrating your loss, raging, stomping, feeling the pain, showing the pain, it feels like you're demonstrating to the person that's died, look, this is how bad I'm feeling. You can see I'm suffering. The level of my love for you is the level of my suffering for you. And I'm being loyal to you by demonstrating and living that suffering. And so there's this feeling of terrible guilt that somehow you've abandoned them or denied them or stopped loving them when you have moments of joy. And of course, as human beings, we're capable of multiple feelings, multiple relationships, and loving one person and growing a relationship with somebody else doesn't knock the other one out, and that we can hold deep sadness and deep joy at the same time. And I think often we have this very kind of bi-directional view of ourselves, that we want to be tidy and clear and straight. And one thing grief isn't is that it's messy, chaotic, contradictory, crazy making, and complex.
Yes, no, that makes perfect sense. And I guess one thing to think is that, you know, you can feel happy, but the grief will come back again. You know, we know that grief comes in waves. We know it jumps up on us when we least expect it. So in some ways, enjoy the joy, enjoy moving on, because the grief will stay with you. It's your companion. Can we move
Embrace
on?
it. And one of the things I talk to people about that is that you can choose to draw up the person to make them front of mind. So, you know, we talked before about accommodation of grief. So the grief doesn't lessen, but you build your life around the grief. And as you adjust to this new reality and you find yourself having moments of joy or going with friends and laughing and engaging and embracing it, it's, as you say, it's your companion. So you put the person that you love at the back of your mind, and you don't lose them. You can choose at any point, even when you're having a nice time, to go and give yourself a few minutes and talk to the person that's died, bring them front of mind, you know, give yourself self-compassion, them compassion and love, and, you know, kind of remind yourself and them, because the relationship, you never stop talking to them. I'll be back. I haven't left you. And that can be very helpful.
Absolutely. So I think that takes us perfectly into, you know, the kinds of things we can do to try to help us resolve or release our guilt? What are some of the strategies that you would recommend?
I mean, I think the first step is to give yourself permission not to suffer in this way, to give yourself permission and self-compassion and the kindness you would give to anybody else, that feeling guilty is not your sentence that you're stuck with for the rest of your life, that you have a choice and you can make a decision to begin to find ways of living your life and diminishing the level of guilt that you feel. So I think that's the first thing. And then there are many ways. And then I think the other thing is that if you're a perfectionist and you're always kind of wanting things to be perfect, you look for more control. So I think part of it is understanding the paradox, that sort of recognizing the aspects of yourself and life that you don't have control over, the more likely it is that you will adjust and that you'll heal. So I think that is sort of important prerequisites. And then there are many different things that we can do. So you could list all the things that you wish you'd done differently, like get them down, write them down, rather than going on this loop in your head, write them down on a list. And then maybe on another day, so you can't do everything at once, you could write an apology letter. And that apology letter can be a postcard of a few lines. It can be a number of postcards. It can be a long letter. It can be many letters, so that you find a way of saying the words that you didn't say to the person at the time, but you put them down on a letter. And maybe you can do something symbolic with that letter when you feel like you've really said everything that you need to say. And there are many different symbolic things that you could do. You could bury it, you could put it somewhere safe, you can put it in the memory box, you can talk to a friend about it, but let it serve as an acknowledgement of what you want to apologize for, and find a way of expressing it. Maybe make the decision for a guilt-free morning. You know, so there's this idea that for worries, you can say, listen, I'm going to question the worry. Is it a legitimate worry, or is it me on an anxiety loop? No, it's not anything I can change. It's not something I have control over. I'm going to give myself 4 hours when I don't worry. In the same way with the guilt, you can make the decision, I'm going to give myself a manageable amount of time. It may be just 2 hours, 1 hour, where you're not going to worry. And one of the kind of tools that you could help with that is an EMDR tool. It's on my Instagram. It's called the container, that you could pop the guilt in the safe or the container and do the bilateral tapping to kind of block it, so that you kind of push it away, you intentionally push it away. I think the thing that you talked about is talk to yourself as a best friend, or tell the story from your father's voice. I think that's a really useful way of thinking about it. And then I think maybe talk to yourself first, but then again to a therapist or a friend, like, what would it take for you to forgive yourself? Like, what is this life sentence that you're giving yourself? What are the barriers of forgiveness to yourself? What is blocking you? Where do they come from? Do they come from beliefs that were installed by your grandparents, your parents, society, your religion? Kind of try to unravel what it is that is so unforgivable that you have to grip tight to your guilt. So try and work that out. I mean, doing that for yourself in many different aspects of grief, looking at your roots and understanding your belief systems and whether they're useful for you now. And they may be belief systems that you learned in response to events, or they may be belief systems that you were taught. But either way, you need to kind of work out, are they useful for me now? Are they serving me, given who I am, the situation I'm in, and what I need for my life going forward? Also, I think this magical thinking that, you know, if I love someone enough, they will survive. And I think we need the humility to recognize our limits. You know, we are not God. There are limits of what we can do, however much we want or wish or pray or want things to be different. We are fundamentally powerless over these big events. It doesn't mean that we're a bad person. It doesn't mean that we've done something wrong, but there are things in life that we have no control over and that we suffer. And you can't wrench that suffering to the ground and block it by thinking your way out of it. part of the suffering is to let it to come through your system, to give yourself the support and the kindness and connection to others to bear it, to give yourself the resilience, but you can't wrench control over it. And also within that, kind of recognize, given what you knew at the time, the person that you were. So a lot of those what ifs come from retrospect. And I do it, you know, I've gone to the supermarket and I've left my purse behind. That's a minute example. But you go, why didn't I remember? I'm such an idiot. And, you know, multiply that by 1,000 with guilt when somebody that you love dies. But, you know, what you knew at the time is what you knew at the time. And you have to kind of do a reckoning of that and a recognizing of that and an acknowledgement of that. And my last kind of thought for this, and maybe there are thousands of others, but these are the ones I've got for this morning, is the serenity prayer. I don't know if everybody listening knows the serenity prayer, which is, God, give me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, the courage to change the things I can, and the wisdom to know the difference.
That's really wonderful. It sounds a little bit like you should deal with guilt in the same way that you deal with grief, in that you need to spend some time getting close to it, examining it, looking at the details of it, and at other points giving yourself breaks from it. So you have to kind of move between these two states. But those are wonderful, very wise words. I think we now have quite a lot of questions that have come in. So I'm going to start sort of going through these. So there's a guilt of ambivalence. How do you handle the guilt of ambivalence following the death of someone who you had a difficult relationship with? So we've covered some of that, but
yes, I mean, the ambivalence is that you love and hate them, and then with the death, there's no opportunity for reparation, as it were. So you're left with the ambivalence of love and hate, and that can really induce massive amount of guilt. And I mean, I think that in asking the question, that's a very good first step, that you're recognizing that your relationship is ambivalent. I mean, some people don't even have that awareness. And maybe, I don't know what you think, or other people, if they got ideas, I would begin to explore and find words for all the different sources of the ambivalence. What were the things in the relationship that really you value and are precious that you want to hold on to? What were the aspects of the relationship that you really find difficult, gave you a lot of pain, you suffered with? And maybe some of the guilt from the ambivalence is that you're relieved that the person has died, that they can't hurt you anymore. Because another guilt, of course, is when someone has been, that we haven't liked in our life, or actually has been very ill through their life and they've died. And so that kind of witnessing of their suffering or them hurting us is now over, and you can feel guilty that if you're a good person, you shouldn't feel relieved as someone's died. But of course, we have lots of feelings. We don't control what we feel. We only have agency over what we do with what we feel. And what's incredibly damaging is when we turn that feeling against ourselves.
I think that makes sense. And I sometimes wonder too, if we get fixated on specific memories that we really judge ourselves for, and trying to expand the repertoire of what we remember, that actually trying to go to different points in the relationship and concentrate on other kinds of memories, so that you see, as you say, the really strong parts of the relationship, the good, the bad parts, and try to come up with a more nuanced view, that there was good and there was bad, so that you stop blaming yourself and you see that both people have responsibility in some way.
And to add to that, that you can have conversations with different people that knew the person that you have felt ambivalent about, so that you can, because you can sort of drive yourself crazy that, am I wrong to have this feeling? But if you talk to the person's closest friends, their family members, maybe even people that they worked with, and kind of work out what is a familiar theme and learn more about them as well, because that might give you compassion for them and compassion for yourself. But often discovering more about the person that's died does humanize them, and then can humanize your relationship with them once they've died. Demonizing their relationship with them lives in you in a kind of demonic way. So that needs to be dealt with.
We have some questions that are sort of linked. One about the guilt about not being able to see a family member during COVID. How do we get over the guilt of not having visited our loved ones when they are unwell and far away to protect them from COVID, but they have died?
So painful. I mean, I think very much along the lines of what we've said is that, acknowledging and naming the sadness and the loss for you and them, that this wasn't in your gift. You weren't able to go and say goodbye. But maybe finding a form of words and writing them a letter of what you would have said, or the conversation you would have had with them if you'd been with them. So find a way of expressing it. Maybe do something symbolic that represents your love for them and what you would have liked to have done with other family members, so that you can feel the connection and the love that you feel for them, although you weren't there. I don't know whether you can get information from where they died, from the care home or the hospital, so that you can find, maybe what happened. I mean, I've had many stories of amazing health professionals have been the intermediaries for families and been as loving. And of course, it's not the same, but making sure that the person that died did not feel alone, that they were with someone, that they felt their compassion and empathy and care for them. But it certainly ramps up the feelings of the complexity of the grief if you didn't have the opportunity to say goodbye. And finding ways of writing it or saying it may be a first step in coming to terms with it.
I think that makes sense. And I guess sometimes you can think of also things you might do. If this person wanted you to, I don't know, do your garden more. There might be ways of taking positive steps in our lives that help us to remember them and that we feel somehow is making amends. So many people who've lost kids because of drunk driving. They start charities, they do these amazing actions. So there might also be small ways that we can take positive steps that help us, that remember the person who's died, but also alleviate that guilt in some way.
Yeah, I think that's a lovely thing. I mean, I think altruism, helping others helps you feel good about yourself, and doing it in relation and honoring the person that died can be incredibly curative. So it might be volunteering with an organization, it might be planting tulips, and it can be Dad's tulip bed. It might be visiting the person who's died best friend who you think is lonely. So kind of acts of love and compassion to others in memory of the person that's died, I think is a really lovely way of doing it. It can be very healing.
We have a question about the tension over different kinds of grieving patterns. So what about the feelings of guilt that you are grieving in a different way to other family members, or they feel you aren't grieving as much as they are?
I mean, that probably every family in the world that is grieving will have a version of that question, because I think one of the misunderstandings about grief is that it's a sort of universal, uniform demonstration of who we are and the person, and how we do it will be the same. And every family member will have had a different relationship with the person that died, and how they express or feel their grief will be unique to them, even if they were siblings with the same parent. And so I think one of the things to recognize is to allow difference, and that, grief is invisible. That's one of the complexities of it. If you have a broken arm, you kind of got your bandage and your plaster. The wounds that we feel from grief are invisible, and only a third of what we're saying, what we show, is sort of an iceberg is the common metaphor, is that a third of what we say and what we are seen to do is what is the third of the iceberg above the waterline. I can't get my words. And 2/3, what we're feeling, the pain of it, the suffering, the expression of it, is invisible below the waterline. And so you can have a 17-year-old son whose dad died, who is not crying at all, who is going out with his mates, who's constantly gaming, doesn't want to talk about his dad. That in no way is an illustration of how sad or not or guilty that he's feeling. In some ways, the more that he's not showing it, maybe the more it's frightening him, and so he needs to deny it at this point, and kind of can't go close to it. So I think the big thing is open communication in families builds trust, allowing people to be themselves, and the parents model grieving. So the leaders in a family, whether it's the grandparents or whoever it is, they have much more power than they give themselves credit for. So naming and owning that we're all going to do this in our own way. What can we do to help each other? What gets in the way of helping each other? What's something that maybe we can do together as a family now and again so that we feel connected? And what do people need that is different from each other that we can support them to have that?
That makes sense. And I think you're right. It's really important to remember that what you see from someone doesn't necessarily express what they're feeling, and trying to create a family context where people feel they can talk about things, and and giving and maybe just having those conversations about the person who's died, so that people can enter in or not enter in, depending on their comfort levels.
The thing that, I think I say this maybe in every single good grief event that I do, but is that as families, I think walking and talking is incredibly cathartic and helpful, because you're not eyeballing each other. You're walking in rhythm, you're outside, which is curative anyway, you're moving your body, and you can find ways of just somebody listening to their sibling or their mum or their dad or whoever it is talking about the person that's died. So having an open conversation that is going through time. So it's like you go for an hour's walk, wherever it is, and then you end up somewhere nice, right now back home, where you'd have a pizza and a drink and you do something that's intentionally comforting. That can be incredibly curative for families. And doing that pretty regularly can be enough for a family to feel close. And that's what they need to do, is not to have these barriers of protection, which is sometimes through disapproval, but sometimes fear that if I show what I feel, I'm going to hurt somebody else. I need to not let them see what I'm feeling, because they couldn't cope with it.
That makes sense. I love the walking and talking. I think that's a brilliant solution. We have a question. It's about guilt from responsibility in the death. How best to deal with guilt when you have some responsibility for the death, such as making end-of-life decisions?
So complicated, isn't it? I think, again, like the fact that you've named it, that you recognize that you made this decision, which was the best decision when you weighed up the costs and the benefits to the person that you made this decision for, or the knowledge that you had at the time. And you have to allow both the feeling of pain and loss that this decision was made, and kind of the feeling of that, and also the recognition of that you need support to manage it, and you need the love and connection to others to help you bear it, so that you can both find ways of living with this complex decision or regret that you have, and not let it kind of completely stall the adaptive grieving process. And for that, you really do need love and connection of others, and probably psychological support.
We've had two questions that I think have similar issues at their heart. One is from Jane. What about things that are within your control? When my mum was terminally ill, there were times when we exchanged angry words. I feel so deeply ashamed that I was not kinder, more patient. I loved her so completely that I cannot forgive myself. And a similar one is my brother died suddenly. He was unwell his whole life with a serious illness. How can I cope with the guilt of the times we had arguments and that I didn't care for him more and better? So again, two sort of questions about feeling guilty about arguments or not behaving as well as these people think they should have done.
I think the first kind of step is recognizing the humanity, that when, where we love most, we hurt most and we fight most. People we live with are the people who annoy us most, who we need most. So of course, when your mum was suffering, she was probably being incredibly difficult and demanding, or she may not have been, but you were both suffering. And, it's really hard to be your best self when you're really suffering. So to kind of recognize that in relationship, where you love, you are going to hurt each other. And that is part of being human. This isn't, in retrospect, trying to curate having this perfect relationship where you were the perfect sibling, the perfect daughter, the perfect partner, is completely facile. That perfection is never there. We have always and will always do things that hurt and that we have regrets over. But when people are alive, we have the opportunity for repair. So it's never about the fight, it's always about the repair. And the devastation of death is that you don't get the opportunity for repair. So in some ways, I would go back and look at the ideas that Liesl and I talked about before, which is to look at your belief system and look at what are the blockers to you forgiving yourself. What is the thing that's stalling that? What's getting in the way of that? What are the messages that you've had about forgiveness? And maybe a version of writing them letters or doing an act of kindness for them that feels like you're in some way showing the living and writing and showing the apology that you can't say to them. And of course, turn to yourself with self-compassion and allow yourself to forgive yourself.
I think that's right. And I think there, just as you say, writing, I think there's something powerful too about just saying, I'm sorry out loud. It's just, saying from your heart, I'm really sorry we had these fights. I love you so very much. And actually saying those words can feel very powerful. Whether you believe in an afterlife or not, I think, and then imagining what they'd say back to you, because 9 times out of 10 they'd say, that's okay, I love you.
Don't worry.
But we feel terribly responsible at these moments. I have another question, which I think goes into the kind of magical thinking that we've been talking about. Can you talk about the guilt over the fact I could not give the person I love more than anything the one thing he wanted, to live? I didn't do something wrong, but against all logic, I feel awful I couldn't save him. I feel I let him down.
Yeah. I mean, the magical thinking of that is conflating the feeling that if I love him enough and give him enough love, then he will survive. And of course, the fact of that is that this was never in your gift. It was never an opportunity that you could ever give them, or a way of loving them that was ever possible for you to do. And I think it's part of what Liesl talked about, is that it's a way of denial too, that, that if you're ruminating on this and looping on this, you're very understandably kind of looking retrospectively and not dealing with the fact that they've died, this person that is that you love most in the world. And so, I'm sorry to say it, but the task of mourning is facing the reality of the death and allowing yourself to feel the pain of it and process and adjust to this new reality. And so I would encourage you to find ways of doing that both support you to do it and allow you to face the reality of it, and incrementally, not all the time. Like we talked before, it's loss orientation, where you allow yourself to feel the pain and emote and grieve, and restoration orientation, where you have a break from your grief, you get on with your day, you have denial, you can do whatever it is that can block it for now, and you oscillate between the two. But when you get stuck on the denial, that keeps you stuck in the process of grieving, and then that blocks your capacity to adapt and grow through your life, and learn to live with it.
Thank you. That's very wise words. This is a question that deals with someone being isolated. What if you don't have the love and support of others, or you chose not to share your grief and guilt with others? How can you find healing on your own? Can you find healing on your own?
Oh my goodness. I mean, there must be a very complex story underneath that. And I think there are 9 million people that live in this country alone, and some of them have one telephone call a week. So this is by no means an isolated incident. I am sorry that you're on your own. I don't mean that in a patronizing way. Maybe you needed to protect yourself by not having connection with others. I think the best that you can do is to turn to yourself as if you were a friend, with self-compassion. Kristin Neff is a wonderful American psychologist who's done a lot of research on self-compassion, and her website has a lot of films and tools that can help you turn to yourself with self-compassion. But I think all the things that we've talked about today, of writing letters, demonstrating the sadness that you feel, the guilt that you feel, kind of finding physical ways of expressing your grief, is a really good first step. And actually going to organizations that can support you. Go to Cruise, go to Marie Curie, go to BACP. There's a list of organizations on the Good Grief Festival blog website where you can find support. So maybe that's another chance for you, another choice for you.
Thank you. This question is quite short, and again, like the last one, there's a sense there must be a lot more behind it. The question is, can you suggest ways to communicate around guilt when shame is in the room? So I guess you can imagine there's a family structure. That's what I'm sort of picturing. We don't really know, but what are some ways to try to start the conversation around guilt when there is a more closed, family structure or a sense of shame?
I mean, Brené Brown is so good on shame and guilt. And shame, is the sort of toxic aspect of guilt, as you say, that blocks it. And maybe the recognition in the family, when there's shame in the room, is to name it publicly. I don't know if it's safe enough for you to do that, but maybe name it in your own head that I'm feeling the shame. Support yourself that you recognize that, and then try and move beyond it to be more kind of compassionate to other people and connect with them. And shame is very physical, isn't it? It kind of toxifies your whole body. But maybe that's a first step. Maybe doing a mindful meditation to calm you would help you. And the thing I'd like to say to this person and to the person that asked before who's on their own, I think the fact that you're asking for help and you're wanting support is an amazing first step. It shows that you're kind of wanting to change what is happening for you, and that in itself is a shift in the pattern. And that is a very good indicator that you're doing that. So I'm really pleased you've asked these questions.
Thank you. This is a question about grief and guilt alongside personality disorders. Do you think grief and how to get through grief is different for persons with personality disorders. I have BPD, borderline personality disorder, and I'm really struggling with feelings of guilt and grief as intensely as when my husband passed away 13 months ago.
I mean, what I would think about that, I'm not a psychologist, so I don't give people diagnoses. But how I would see you with BPD is that you have a fragile process, so that everything that you feel more intensely than someone who doesn't have a fragile process, so that someone's empathic towards you, you can be overwhelmed, it can be too much. So the thing that you need most with BPD, I would have thought, is attunement, that someone really goes at your pace, very gently, in the time and way that you need, and that they work with you, attune with you, so that you feel that you have enough of yourself that's met without being overwhelmed and triggered into kind of switching. So that would be my first step. But I would imagine that you do need psychological support. I hope you're getting it.
Thanks, that's good advice. We have a sort of complicated grief question from Anne.
As if the others weren't complicated.
As if the others weren't. No, you're right. They're all quite complicated. It's, so this is from Anne. This is a kind of guilt, non-guilt. I don't feel guilty, so I don't feel guilty that I supported my fiancé's decision not to have more chemo. So there's not guilt over that. But my mother-in-law tries to make me feel guilty for not making him have more chemo. It's so tough that now we've become estranged and there's guilt about the estrangement.
Oh my goodness, I'm so sorry. Where you need each other most and you kind of could really support each other most, this sort of guilt-inducing blame that's been put onto you. And of course, when people are grieving, blame is a kind of fast-track place that people go. So it sounds like his mum is blaming you. And blame really, it's a natural response in grief, but it does interfere with the grieving process, and it blocks you because, of course, you're projecting all your energy onto the person that you're blaming rather than in the grieving process yourself. So I guess in a way, you have no control over what your mother-in-law or your partner's mother feels. And it sounds like you both had to put in boundaries to protect yourself. And maybe that's the most that you can do, is put in a boundary to protect yourself now. And that maybe in 6 months' time, when the grieving is less intense, you can create an opportunity to repair and reconnect and restore. But maybe it's not the right time now. Maybe you can get a family member or someone to come and help you and do that together. But now maybe you just need to focus on yourself and allow yourself to process this without feeling guilty in relation to his mum, because that really isn't your responsibility. Your responsibility was you in relation to him and how you knew that is together. And it seems that you're very clean and clear on that. I'd stick with that right now.
We're nearly out of time, but I wonder if I could just squeeze in one final quick question. It's a question about the relationship between guilt and anger. So it's a woman who's written in, her husband died a year ago. She's incredibly angry with him, and she feels guilty because of the anger.
So anger is an expression of hurt. We're wired to feel angry, and you're probably angrier with him for leaving you and dying in death than you ever were in life. So I guess my first message is to let yourself know that it's normal to feel angry. It's an expression of hurt. On my Instagram, I've done a tool that can help you manage your anger. So it's not just about venting, but ways of kind of getting the anger out, soothing yourself, calming yourself, and then doing a couple of things that help you kind of switch so you don't get stuck in it. Because if you vent all the time, it increases and circulates the anger through your system and blocks any other feeling coming in. So it's like jumping in and out of puddles, giving yourself opportunities to feel and express your anger in a safe way that doesn't hurt you or people around you, and then choosing to do other things that distract you from the anger so that it doesn't override everything else. That's my first step.
That's fantastic. We're just about out of time. Can I ask everyone who's attended today to take 2 minutes to complete the survey about the festival? If everybody could do this, we'll have a great chance of making this an annual event. And if you could please complete the survey only once if you're attending multiple events. But really, that just leaves me to say a huge thank you to Julia Samuel, who, as ever, is wise, compassionate, and full of good ideas. Thank you so much for joining us with Good Grief. And you can follow Julia on Instagram. You can follow me on Twitter. But thank you so much, Julia.
Well, thank you, Liesl, and thank you, everyone that's listening. And I think one of the things about guilt and grief is that it's, I feel a bit guilty that my answers aren't perfect answers, that I wasn't able to fix everything for you. And I think that is the kind of perfect demonstration, is that we want to have control and we want to be able to fix things. And the paradox is that we can't. But the thing that we can do, and that Good Grief, I'm enormously grateful for, allows, is that we come together as a community to begin to have connection with each other, understanding ideas, thoughts. And maybe this one isn't the right one for you, but there are countless other places within the Good Grief website and grief channel where you might find things that support you. But the fact that you're on this shows that you're making the first step for support, and that is a really good thing. So I kind of appreciate you for that. And thank you, Liesl, for your brilliant questions and curating of this.
Oh, you're very welcome. Thank you so much. And thank you to our audience, and goodbye for now.